I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. By early January 1844, the Mormons were in a state of flux. Politically, religiously, otherwise, constant uncertainty. Joe had yet to declare himself candidate for president, but that was at the forefront of his mind. Like any senator who doesn't run for re-election because the next year is a presidential election, but Joe's was still waiting to formally declare his candidacy. That's where he was in the first month of 1844. Like any presidential candidate, Joe wanted to make his debut on the public stage with proper reasons. He had Whiteout Willard Richards draft his campaign platform, while Joe set about writing letters and reading various articles from papers around the nation that were written about the Mormons. From the Dan Vogel History of the Church, Volume 6, page 172, quote, "The Alton Telegraph published several very severe articles against the church. Edward Brotherton published a scurrilous pamphlet at Manchester, England, entitled Mormonism, Its Rise and Progress, and the Prophet Joseph Smith. The Richmond Palladium published an amusing and favorable article on Mormonism. The Boston Bee published a series of articles favorable to the saints, which had a beneficial effect in putting down prejudice and representation. A favorable account of a visit to Nauvoo was published by Samuel A. Pryor, Methodist minister. The Morning Star, a Free Will Baptist paper, published a long and bitter article against the Latter-day Saints entitled Mormon Perversion. A favorable article entitled Nauvoo and Mormonism was published by a traveler. The Quincy Whig published several bitter articles against me. The Warsaw Message and subsequently the Warsaw Signal published a continual tirade of abuse, misrepresentation, and lies against the saints. The New Haven, Connecticut Herald published a favorable account of the Mormons in Nauvoo." End quote. Yes, the Mormons were the talk of the nation. Unfortunately, the history of the church wasn't kind enough to print each of those articles for us to read later on. It just merely references them. So I decided to do a little digging myself on a few newspaper archive sites. Now, just a brief digression before reading some articles here. Today's show really illustrates how the internet has fundamentally shifted the social science of history. Until very recently, and I mean extremely recently, within the last 10 years, access to hundreds of thousands of newspapers would have required a person's entire life of traveling to various local historical societies and reading each edition of each paper individually in order to find what they're looking for. I've collected a dozen stories about Mormonism for today, and it took me just a couple of days of searching and reading and culling out the parts that I wanted and didn't want. For a historian to collect all of these 10 years ago even would have been weeks of traveling, making phone calls to archivists, reading faxed copies and throwing away most of them because they aren't relevant, and weeks or months beyond that to verify an actual holograph copy of these papers to ensure the accuracy of the transcripts. Today, I can do a search of multiple databases of indexed newspapers with high-resolution scans of the originals and find exactly what I'm looking for among so many other gems. With that in mind, for today's episode, I did my best to find a representative set of articles here. You may hear the general tone of the majority of these articles is either negative or benign towards the Mormons. But the fact of the matter is, the media generally didn't like the Mormons, because the public didn't like the Mormons. And when the media didn't like the Mormons, that fed the hungry readers who wanted to hear about the latest happenings and scandals in the Mormon Empire. This only shaped people's prejudice even more, which in turn made them even more excited to buy the next issue of the paper that reported on the next Mormon scandal. It was this feedback loop that shaped the minds of Americans, and the Americans who bought the papers shaped the articles with their purchasing power. Very little of this feedback loop was supportive of Joe and the Mormons. Even outlets that were largely sympathetic to the Mormons were printing and reprinting articles about troubling aspects of how the city was being run, often with large excerpts from the Times and Seasons or the Nauvoo Neighbor, the Mormon periodicals. But the truth is, Nauvoo Mormonism in 1843 and 44 didn't do much that was viewed publicly as good. What happened that the national media could report positively on? What happened? I mean, new businesses cropping up, new buildings being dedicated, headlines with new brick foundry built by the Mormons. That doesn't sell papers. Horrible Mormon murder, or General Joseph Smith's special privileges, or Mormon massacre. Those headlines sell paper subscriptions. The point is, the Mormons, and Joseph Smith specifically, didn't really do anything headline worthy that was good. This feedback loop that happened at the time, it seems to happen now, of media feeding the public apocalyptic end-of-the-world narratives, and then the public feeding the media through clicks and subscriptions and, giving their money to it. That's nothing new. It's always existed. And anybody who says that this feedback loop started in recent memory or during their lifetime should have their perception checked, because this Ouroboros has existed for a long time. These feedback loops have real-world impact as well. Look, the public went crazy over the latest Mormon scandal, and then the Mormons reacted by deflecting or manufacturing another scandal, which kept the public whipped up and talking about the Mormons until the next scandal broke and the city resolutions were passed in Nauvoo as a response to that scandal. Then public outrage begins over the latest resolution or the latest ordinance, and the whole cycle repeated at the next heightened level of chaos. This is fuel to a persecution narrative. The outrage machine only benefits those who drive it. So with that out of the way, let's see what the national media was saying about the Mormons. I've transcribed a bunch of these articles in no particular order, and I'm just going to comment as we go along reading them. This is from the Alton Telegraph. Quote, "We regard the location of this unprincipled scoundrel in Illinois as one of the greatest calamities that ever befell the state. He and those over whom he exercises the most unlimited control now hold the balance of political power in this state. Governed by no political principles whatsoever, they at every election throw themselves in market like cattle for sale." End quote. That's a focus of a lot of these articles about the Mormons in 1843 and 44, is their political power and how Joe was able to throw it around at his whim. Whatever he decided needed to be politically expedient for the Mormons stepped right in line behind him. This is from Edward Brotherton. Quote, "Suffice it to say that it is clearly established that a system of all but universal female prostitution exists at Nauvoo as a secret regulation of the church, none but the faithful being permitted to have the privilege. They teach that this system is what we are to understand by the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." End quote. Sexual scandals are always the most salacious scandals that everybody pays attention to. The president getting a blowjob from one of his underlings. Oh, well, we can't have that. We better impeach him, right? These are constant with Mormonism. Constant scandals. And John C. Reckitt Bennett fed a lot into these with his expose on the history of the saints, because so much of it was focused around the practice of polygamy. This is from the Quincy Whig. And the Quincy Whig, to be clear, when the Mormons first arrived in Quincy, and as a result of the Mormon exodus from Missouri in 1839, the Quincy Whig was very sympathetic to the Mormons out of Quincy, Illinois. And Quincy was a town about 30 miles from Nauvoo along the Mississippi. They were kind to the Mormons. That was until the Mormons began exercising overt political power, and the old citizens of Illinois started getting angry with how much power the Mormons held. So the Quincy Whig around 1840, late 1841 into early 1842, much like John C. Reckitt Bennett shifted in his tone and narrative about the Mormons and eventually became a vicious opponent, the same thing happened around the same time with the Quincy Whig. They were sympathetic and kind to the Mormons, but by this time in late 1843 and early 44, they were vicious opponents. Here we go. This is a longer article, but it's just so packed full of gems. Here we go. Quote, "Nauvoo City Council, General Joseph Smith, privileges, etc. The latest Nauvoo neighbor contains several ordinances passed by the City Council, and among others, one entitled An Extra Ordinance for the Extra Case of Joseph Smith and Others." We discussed this last episode. The preamble to this ordinance sets forth that Joseph Smith has been greatly harassed by the persecutions of his enemies and by the repeated requisitions of Missouri for his person, and therefore it is enacted that hereafter if any person or persons shall come with process, demand, or requisition founded upon the aforesaid Missouri difficulties to arrest said Smith, he or they shall be subject to be arrested by any officer of the city with or without process. and tried by the municipal court upon testimony, and if found guilty, sentenced to imprisonment in the city prison for life, which convict or convicts can only be pardoned by the governor with the consent of the mayor of said city. Now, like I said, we talked about that last episode, and it created a massive groundswell of opposition to the growing powers of the Nauvoo municipal government. Here is how the Quincy Whig is shining in on it. Here is a pretty kettle of fish, truly. A pretty kettle of fish. Where did these old sayings go? That's just so good. Governor Ford must keep quiet hereafter with his processes, demands, and requisitions, or if his officers should dare invade the dominions of General Smith, an example will be made of them instanter. Their liberties shall be taken from them forever. The Nauvoo City Council hath said it, and the enactments of the City Council are backed up by the bayonets of the Nauvoo Legion, so says a Mormon. It is, indeed it is, a shame and a pity that the loco-foco authorities of Missouri and Illinois will not let the poor, inoffensive, defenseless, quiet, law-abiding Mormons rest in quiet in their newfound Jerusalem. Even Governor Ford shall bestow an act of clemency without the consent of the mayor of Nauvoo, so says this City Council. And there are exclamation points peppered throughout all of these articles when they want to emphasize things. It's like people tweeting in all caps as if like that's them yelling. They did it with exclamation points, and there are just exclamation points in the middle of sentences here where they wanted emphasis on what they were saying. It's so good. The same city council and Joseph Smith mayor have passed another ordinance entitled An Ordinance for the Health and Convenience of Travelers and Other Persons. This ordinance sets forth that the mayor of the city, Joseph Smith, be and is hereby authorized to sell or give spirits of any quantity, as he in his wisdom shall judge to be for the health, comfort, or convenience of such travelers or other persons as shall visit his house from time to time. Okay, so that was quoting all from this ordinance, right? So Joseph Smith, the city of Nauvoo was a temperate society. They had passed temperance bills at the hand of the teetotaler, John C. Reckitt Bennett. But here's an ordinance that is passed especially for Joseph Smith so he can have a bar legally in his Nauvoo mansion to serve the non-Mormon visitors of Nauvoo, especially dignitaries and high-level politicians who want to get their drank on in the party city of Nauvoo with some of the prostitutes. He passed a special ordinance so that he can sell them liquor as mayor. And of course, this is how the Quincy Whig comments on it. How charitable this towards the travelers and other persons. How convenient for the mayor of the city, General Joseph himself. This really is an amusing specimen of humbug of the shallowest description when it is recollected that General Joseph Smith, commander of the Nauvoo Legion, mayor of the city, prophet in these last days, etc., 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 is a hotel keeper and craves the loose change that usually drops from the passing traveler, particularly those who have not taken the pledge of intemperance, of course, in passing through our cities and towns. Truly, 'tis an amusing sight to see the great, entitled men of the earth, all with exclamation points, stooping to the low condition of retailing whiskey at a picayune a dram. How art thou fallen, mighty Joseph? End quote. I mean, it's so good. It's so good. The thing is I love reading the terminology and the emphasis and the way that the people back in the 1840s were conveying these ideas that were so very important to them at the time. This was the end of the world. Joseph Smith, with extreme political power, passing these city ordinances to make him God of Nauvoo. It was unconscionable to these people. And this is how they were conveying these ideas and these sentiments, that he was overstepping his boundaries. And come on, I mean, what a great term to describe it with. Here is a pretty kettle of fish, truly. All right, so here's one of the few articles that I could find that were friendly to the Mormons. And when I say a few that I could find, not a few that I included in the show notes that I'm reading from today, but a few that existed that were friendly towards the Mormons. And it says nothing of Joseph Smith, right? This is one of the very, very few that I could find that was not scathing towards the Mormons. From the Boston Weekly Bee, quote, On Thursday evening, agreeable to appointment, Elder George J. Adams addressed a large concourse of people on the character and mission of Joseph Smith the prophet. In speaking of him, he bears a positive and direct testimony to the divinity of his mission. He does this without hesitation, just as if he meant what he said and said what he meant. He does not say that he hopes Joseph Smith is a true prophet, but says he is positive that such is the fact. The Boylston Hall was a perfect jam during the day and evening. On Tuesday evening, he gave his farewell lecture. That was a rich treat indeed, embodying the outline of the faith and doctrine of the Latter-day Saints. But on Wednesday evening, at the Great D Party, was the time it was clearly manifested the kindest feelings existed in the city towards the Mormons. There were present on that occasion over 500 people. 350 sat down at the first table. After supper, Elder Adams delivered a very appropriate and eloquent address. It was listened to with profound attention, during which time we saw the tear start in many an eye." End quote. So this article, one of the very few that I could find that was favorable towards the Mormons, only talked about one of the missionaries giving a good lecture about the character and mission of Joseph Smith the prophet. Obviously invoking all sorts of narratives about what they have suffered in Missouri and, the religious freedom that they can believe what they want, and that he believes not only that it's a true belief that Joseph Smith is a true prophet, but he states that it is a fact. I know that Joseph Smith is a prophet. Back to, obviously, less friendly articles, because those were a dime a dozen and so much easier to find. This is out of the Pittsburgh Gazette. Quote, "Mormon troubles! We learned from the Warsaw Signal that the Mormon difficulties in Hancock County, Illinois are increasing. A long list of acts of thieving are given attributed to the Mormons. Public meetings have been called by the anti-Mormons to take measures to defend and protect themselves from these depredations. The end of the troubles in that region is not yet. The Warsaw paper tells of the story of a farmer of McDonough County who brought a load of pork to Nauvoo and sold it readily for the hard cash. He had not got out of town, however, before he found that such cash was all bogus. Hastening back, he found his pork had just been taken passage over to the new state of Iowa." End quote. I mean, it's fair. I mean, a lot of the Nauvoo economy was based on bogus, and when people would come into Nauvoo from outside and import their goods to sell in the town square of Nauvoo and all the various market districts that were throughout the entire city, they might sell it and get some hard coin and actual, hard specie for the goods that they're selling. But then they get out of town and they realize that it's all bogus. And that money is only good in Nauvoo. And, you can't pay your taxes with that. You can't buy stuff out of Nauvoo with that. You can't pay your bills with Nauvoo bogus. It's only good in Nauvoo. Frustrating time. And of course, it's understandable that the citizens of Warsaw were calling and passing resolutions to stop this from happening, because what this amounted to was the Mormons were stealing their goods by paying for the goods with counterfeit money. Here's an interesting example that I found of talking about Mormonism in passing as an example of how crazy things were in the year of 1843. This was published in the Holly Springs Gazette out of Mississippi in January of 1844, obviously reflecting on the past year. Quote, "The past year. The past has been a strange and memorable year. With the aged, it must ever be remembered, and by the young, its strangely sublime and ludicrous events can never be forgotten. To the wise, there has been much for reflection. To the superstitious, much to alarm and terrify. Earthquakes welcomed it into being, comets presided o'er its spring, and floods have washed it into the past. Religion, gliding into fanaticism, almost bowed to the prophecy of Miller." Now, that's important, right? Because William Miller prophesied that the world would end in 1843. He was wrong, and then he moved it to 1844, and he was wrong again. But the Seventh-day Adventists kind of grew out of that whole tradition, and all of the Millerites, this is a contemporary market opponent, a competitor of Mormonism. So it says if religion gliding into fanaticism almost bowed to the prophecy of Miller, and then it continues, "or listened with credulous ear to the wilder jargon of the Mormons. Piety and virtue were almost forgotten, and events that should have endeared them to man but dimmed their luster or enfeebled their followers. End quote. So Mormonism in this Holly Springs Gazette out of Mississippi was used as an example of religious fanaticism, even crazier than those crazy Millerites who thought that the comet passing over in 1843 was the end of the world. It's just interesting that Mormonism was being used as an example of how crazy the world was getting. This is the Lancaster Gazette out of Lancashire, England. This was funny because Mormonism was gaining a large foothold in England at this time. The immigration fund had been set up by Brigham Young to bring Mormons who had converted from England to Nauvoo for the price of a mere £4. You would give your £4 to the leadership there in England. They would put you on a specially chartered ship, and that ship would bring you to New Orleans, and then a separate steamer would take you all the way up the Mississippi to Nauvoo. Depending on the time of year, it might also just drop you off in Buffalo, and then you take various steamers or rail to get to Nauvoo instead. Regardless, this was a funny article, and I haven't verified the information in it, but I think it's funny because, once again, it's using Mormon to describe how crazy the world has gotten. Quote, Mormon. This word, it should be known by all, is a Greek word. Donegan and other authors of Greek dictionaries define it as a bugbear, a hobgoblin, a raw head and bloody bones, a hideous specter, a frightful mask, or something to frighten children. That's apparently the definition of the word Mormon. The article continues. It is thus used by a Greek author, Aristophanes, the comic poet. Solomon Spaulding, having tried to preach 3 or 4 years and failed, then having tried mercantile business and failed, being a classical Greek scholar and out of all business, wrote for his amusement what he called the Book of Mormon, i.e., as he understood it and meant, the Book of Specters, end quote. Now, so that was funny because it's interweaving so many details of what Mormonism is and Mormon history that were just used to slander it and say that it's just chaos and stupidity, that it's specters, that it's something to frighten children, it's hobgoblin, it's a raw head and bloody bones, it's a hideous specter. That is what describes Mormon and Mormonism. Now, of course, it interweaves in Solomon Spaulding here because it was the general consensus by the non-believing public, which was everybody in the world other than the Mormons, that Solomon Spaulding had written the Book of Mormon under the title of Manuscript Found, and that Sidney Rigdon had pilfered it and given it to Joseph Smith, who then published it as the Book of Mormon. So they say Solomon Spaulding was a guy who tried business and he tried preaching and he failed, but he was a Greek scholar and he knew the definition of Mormon, so he wrote his Book of Specters. And then, of course, Joseph Smith was the guy who published it after Solomon Spaulding had died. So it's just funny. It's just funny to see all of these articles kind of coalescing to describe the general tone, the way that the public viewed Mormonism at the time. The next headline is one that obviously grabbed headlines, and when I saw it, I had to post on the Mormon Historians Facebook group about it because I had never seen this before. This is just something that was completely new information to me, which that happens increasingly less. The more that I study Mormon history, the more things I read and I have a body of knowledge to reference. But this is something that seems so far out there that it wouldn't slip under the radar of Mormon historians, which means that it's most likely fake news. And when I published it up in the Mormon Historians Facebook group, Mel Johnson, the guy who wrote the biography of Lyman Wight, which this article is about Lyman Wight, he had never heard about this either. So needless to say, this is more than likely fake news, but it is quite interesting. And it's out of the Columbia Democrat from Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. Quote, Mormon massacre, in all caps. The account of the murder of Lyman Wright's band of Mormons, 30 in number, is confirmed. They were principally Englishmen and were attempting to rob a store at the time. End quote. So that, what? The murder of Lyman Wright's band of Mormons? Now, this is out of 1844, not out of 1838, when the Mormons were actually massacred. At what point were 30 Mormons massacred under the command of Lyman White? That has no corroboration, and I could not find an article that described what had happened beyond just reprinting this from the Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania article from the Columbia Democrat. So, needless to say, this is one of those things that's more than likely fake news, but it is still quite interesting to see the headlines reporting this and using two words that have so much weight and gravity and sell headlines, Mormon and a massacre, together to sell papers. Because Mormonism was a hot topic, people wanted to talk about it. And when a paper had a cover story that had Mormon in it and massacre in it, they were going to sell out that issue of the paper. Easy as that. We'd need a further explanation than that to describe why some of these articles and newspaper outlets were printing what they are printing. So next, I have a couple of articles that are relatively benign when we consider the grand scheme of most of these articles being very vicious towards the Mormons and finding so few that are actually friendly to them. This is out of the Times of Greater London, the Times, published in London, England. Quote, "By the late accounts from the holy city Nauvoo, the Mormons appear to have settled down into a state of tranquility. They boast that their great and magnificent temple will be completed in a few months." End quote. Just a few more months, that temple will be done. A few more months. Oh, no, it's almost done. We just need a few more months, and that temple will be done. But once again, this is published out of England, and any England newspapers likely weren't reading stuff out of the Times and Seasons, but instead out of the Millennial Star, which was the church's propaganda outlet that was based in Preston, England, and, informing all of the Mormons what was going on in Nauvoo at the time. So it was probably one of the articles that was picked up by them. They read it, and then they reprinted it. Once again, because it has Mormon in the headline, people wanted to read an article that had Mormon in the headline. This is out of the Morning Chronicle, once again from London, England. Quote, "Mormons in Leicester." I don't know how to say some of these. Leicester? I don't know. Leicester. I'm going to go with that. I am going to get an email for that. "A correspondent informs us that this strange sect has obtained a footing in this town and meets on Sundays and Tuesdays near St. Nicholas's Church, when the initiated members speak in the unknown tongues. After one has thus spoken, another brother interprets the mysterious language. Upwards of 100 persons are said to have already joined the Latter-day Saints. They, quote, take the sacrament," that's in its own scare quotes, "in common with other sects, baptize, lay on hands, and believe the Book of Mormon to be equal in importance to the Mosaic writings or the New Testament." End quote. Once again, these are some of the very few benign articles that I was able to find. Almost all of the other ones are vicious. This is out of the Arkansas Intelligencer. Quote, "Nauvoo, the following resolution was recently passed by some Mormons. Resolved, Nauvoo is the great emporium of the West, the center of all centers, a city of 3 years' growth, a population of 18,000 souls." This is another article with a ton of superfluous exclamation points, and they increase. It starts with 1, then it goes to 2, all the way up to 5. Here we go. "Congregated from the 4 quarters of the globe, embracing all intelligence of all nations, with industry, frugality, economy, virtue, and brotherly love unsurpassed in any age of the world. A suitable home for the saints!" With 5 exclamation points. End quote. I love this. It's the reason I'm reading all of these is just to see the mentality of the people at the time. It's hard to get a finger on the pulse of the general public when it comes to their perspective and their understanding of the Mormons, unless we read these articles and really understand what they were talking about at the time. This is out of the Sunbury Gazette from Pennsylvania. Quote, "Joe Smith, the immaculate Mormon prophet, has commenced keeping a tavern in Nauvoo. They say the way he can flirt a gin cocktail is a caution to professors in general." End quote. His gin cocktails are extra potent. Make sure when Joe is pouring your drink, you keep an eye on him. I love that. Okay. a couple of articles about the overt political maneuvers. And once again, now we're transitioning out of the benign articles to, once again, some more of the scathing articles, because there are so few that are friendly to the Mormons and many more that are benign, and many, 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 many more that are just vicious and angry towards the Mormons. This is out of the Whig Standard, out of Washington, D.C., and it's reporting on the first session of the 28th Congress at the end of 1843. Quote, Mr. Adams presented a variety of other petitions. Now, I haven't found the actual text of this petition, but I think it's important. One from the Mormons praying Congress by some legal enactment to acknowledge the supremacy of Christ, which gave rise to questions of orders, appeals, etc., and in the midst of this chaos, the House adjourned. End quote. So this is the first session of the 28th Congress at the end of 1843, beginning to kick off the year of 1844. Apparently there was a petition that, once again, I can't find the exact text of, that the Mormons proposed to Congress, that they wanted the Congress to pass some legal ordinance or enactment that acknowledged the supremacy of Christ, which we should understand basically meant that Mormonism and the leaders of Mormonism at this time in Nauvoo put forward a petition to Congress to declare that the United States is a Christian nation. That is notable in my opinion, especially in light of the White Horse prophecy that was given just 5 years prior to this House of Congress convening for the first session of the 28th Congress. The White Horse prophecy, in case you aren't aware, is that the Constitution will hang on by a thread, and it will be enlightened members of the church that will rescue the Constitution. They were making maneuvers. They were trying to be those who could rescue the Constitution. Out of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, quote, Who shall be our next president? Joe Smith, the Mormon prophet, says in the last number of the Times and Seasons, We shall fix upon the man of our choice and notify our friends duly. Joseph is too modest a man to offer himself? End quote. Obviously, it wasn't just the Mormons who thought that Joe would make a great president. It was the people outside of Mormonism who thought that Joseph Smith would make a terrible president, but knew that he was making maneuvers to become president. It's not like he declared his presidency in a vacuum. He did it in light of what was going on and in the way that he had politically positioned himself. With only 2 exceptions, all of the headlines I just read are from the 3 weeks of December 23rd, 1843 to January 6th, 1844. All of those headlines. Simply put, the Mormons were the talk of the nation. And any headline with Mormon or Joe Smith in it obviously quickly sold. And we read from Brooklyn, from Pennsylvania, from Arkansas, from England, from Mississippi, from Pittsburgh, from all over the nation and even across the pond. Everywhere, people were talking about Mormonism. And people knew that Joe was going to be running for president because he had put himself in that position for the past 4 years that he had been building his kingdom on the Mississippi. It was the perfect time for another Mormon scandal to make its way into the public consciousness. This is from the New York Daily Herald. New York Daily Herald was James Arlington Bennett's paper that was extremely sympathetic to the Mormons, and it published this article that it picked up from England at the very end of 1843. Quote, Horrible Mormon murder. A horrible occurrence took place at Kiev, Cheshire. Cheshire? I don't know how to pronounce these city names. I'm going to get an email. I know. I'm trying my best. Anyway. A horrible occurrence took place at Kiev, Cheshire, where there are a great many Mormons on the 23rd November last. The priest of the order is a blacksmith of the name of Cartwright, and among the devotees is a fanatic of the name Pugmire, also a smith or an engineer. The latter was married to a respectable woman of about 30 years of age, who had borne him 3 children and was in 3 months of her next confinement. So, Pugmire. So the priest, the guy who was, converting Pugmire, his name was Cartwright. Pugmire and his wife were the ones who were looking to be baptized. Here, Pugmire's wife is 6 months pregnant, about 3 months from her next confinement. She had steadily refused to adopt the fanatical opinions of her husband, and much altercation had ensued in consequence. Worn out, however, with his repeated solicitations and his continued declarations that unless she submitted to be baptized into the order, she would be eternally lost, she declared her intention to one of her neighbors to obey her husband's wishes, being satisfied, as she said, that unless she did so, she would never have any more peace with him. So Pugmire is saying, "Oh, we got to convert. We got to get baptized." And she's like, "All right, fine. If you're never going to leave me alone about this, I'll get dunked. Fine. Okay." On Thursday, the 23rd ult, at 8 o'clock at night, the poor, worn-out creature was taken by her husband and the blacksmith priest down to the river below the works, was denuded of all of her clothing except a small flannel singlet, and notwithstanding her interesting situation, these wretched fanatics, after muttering some incantations, plunged her into the stream. The night was dreadfully cold and dark, and, in consequence of the late heavy rains, the river was running at a great rate, and was much higher than ordinary. The priest, having hold of her naked arm, unfortunately let go his grasp, and the current, running like a mill race, immediately carried her away, and it being pitch dark, she was instantly overwhelmed by the boiling flood, and drowned. The husband walked home with the greatest deliberation and nonchalance, and told his neighbors what had occurred, and after seating himself in a chair, rolled himself in flannel, and declared his conviction that it was the will of God that she should be drowned, adding that it was the wickedness of her faith that caused it, but that he was now satisfied that she was in glory. The body of the woman was subsequently found, and a coroner's verdict of manslaughter rendered against the priest and the husband, both of whom were arrested. Talk of romance indeed! Why, the everyday occurrence of life present appalling realities which set at naught the wildest creations of fiction. End quote. Cartwright was the priest, the Mormon, who was baptizing Pugmire. Pugmire kept berating his pregnant wife that she should get baptized. She finally consented to shut him up. They go to baptize her late at night, and she drowns. I don't know, because I've never baptized somebody, but it seems like it's pretty hard when you have somebody in the baptismal grip to just let him go. That seems crazy to me, that the priest just let her go. But apparently that's what happened. And because the water was running so quickly, she got away from him and she drowned. The body was recovered, and both guys were charged with manslaughter. Talk of romance, indeed. But this was a scandal, and this made national headlines when it was picked up by one of the widest circulated newspapers at the time. The New York Daily Herald was one of the most read newspapers in the 1840s, written by friend of the Mormons, James Arlington Bennett, as he was editor, and it was picked up and run all over the country. This was the next big scandal, a Mormon murder. How was this scandal handled? Well, like every other scandal in Joseph Smith's history, deflection. Right? John C. Recket Bennett is publishing exposés about polygamy. Oh, look at how much we were persecuted by Missouri. He's colluding with them. The prophet is the chief suspect in the assassination attempt of a former governor. Oh, what? Have you seen our awesome collection of mummies and papyri? Oh, a pregnant woman died getting baptized in our church? Look at how much of a dick that slave driver John C. Calhoun is. This is from The History of the Church, Volume 6, page 174, where it reprints a little letter exchange between John C. Calhoun and Joseph Smith. Quote, from Mr. John C. Calhoun from Fort Hill, South Carolina, replying to Joseph Smith. Sir, You ask me what would be my rule of action relative to the Mormons or Latter-day Saints should I be elected president, to which I answer that if I should be elected, I would strive to administer the government according to the Constitution and the laws of the Union, and that as they make no distinction between citizens of different religious creeds, I should make none. What a politician John C. Calhoun was. And, I mean, come on, he was a politician from birth. As far as it depends on the executive department, all should have the full benefit of both, and none should be exempt from their operation. But as you refer to the case of Missouri, candor compels me to repeat what I have said to you at Washington, that according to my views, that case does not come within the jurisdiction of the federal government, which is one of limited and specific powers. With respect, I am, etc., etc., signed John C. Calhoun, addressed to Mr. Joseph Smith. And of course, because Joe thought that what was going on in his life was the most important thing going on in the nation at the time, and because he himself was setting up to become the next Whig presidential candidate, and John C. Calhoun, being the Democrat, would be his primary opponent, he decided to take this as a jump-off opportunity to just bury John C. Calhoun for being such a politician with a non-answer, and talking about, the federal government is limited. It is limited in specific powers. If I'm president, I'm sorry, I can't do much for you. John C. Calhoun, we'll see, increasingly becomes Joseph Smith's punching bag through the early 1844. This is Joseph Smith's reply. He used fiery language and emotive arguments to destroy Calhoun's political character. And now this is a long read, but the whole thing is extremely entertaining, and more than anything, it reveals the persecution narrative that Joseph Smith and leaders of the church always leveraged about Missouri. The Missouri persecution narrative that was so well-worn, a well-trodden path in Mormon sermons. It just so happened to take the form of a written letter to this presidential candidate, John C. Calhoun. Quote, "Sir, your reply to my letter of last November concerning your rule of action toward Latter-day Saints if elected president is at hand, and that you and your friends of the same opinion relative to the matter in question may not be disappointed as to me or my mind upon so grave a subject, permit me as a law-abiding man," oh yeah, sure, Joe was a law-abiding man sometimes, "as a well-wisher to the perpetuity of constitutional rights and liberty, and as a friend of the free worship of Almighty God by all, according to the dictates of every person conscious, to say, I am surprised that a man or men in the highest stations of public life should have made up such a fragile view of a case than which there is not one on the face of the globe fraught with so much consequence to the happiness of men in this world or the world to come." Okay. Joe's coming in here pretty hot. And apparently what happened in Missouri to the Mormons, this is of the absolute utmost consequence to all men in this world or the world to come. You know, a couple more dozen Mormons dying and the Mormons having some of their property stolen. Nothing else in the world mattered. Nobody else in this world, no other group of people in the world at this time in 1844 were as persecuted and degraded as the Mormons were. Nobody. This is it. This is the pinnacle of the depravity ever committed on a single group of people ever. What happened to the Mormons in Missouri? Okay. To be sure, the first paragraph of your letter appears very complacent and fair on a white sheet of paper, and who that is ambitious for greatness and power would not have said the same thing? Your oath would bind you to support the Constitution and laws, and as all creeds and religions are alike tolerated, they must of course all be justified or condemned according to merit or demerit. But why, tell me, why are all the principal men held up for public stations so cautiously careful not to publish to the world that they will judge a righteous judgment, law or no law, for laws and opinions like the vanes of steeples change with the wind? One Congress passes a law and another repeals it, and one statesman says that the Constitution means this and another that, and who does not know that they may all be wrong? The opinion and pledge, therefore, in the first paragraph of your reply to my question, like the forced steam from the engine of a steamboat, makes the show of a bright cloud at first, but when it comes in contact with the purer atmosphere, dissolves to common air again. What a great analogy for politics, isn't it? Like the steam the steam forced from the engine of a steamboat. As soon as it, comes out, it looks great. It's big, poofy, and a show of bright cloud at first, but then it all just dissipates into nothing. Yep, I love that. Is possibly one of the very few things that I can actually agree with Joseph Smith on. Your second paragraph leaves you naked before yourself, like a likeness in a mirror, when you say that according to your view, the federal government is one of limited and specific powers and has no jurisdiction in the case of the Mormons. So then, a state can at any time expel any portion of her citizens with impunity, and in the language of Mr. Van Buren, frosted over with your gracious views of the case, though the case is ever so just, government can do nothing for them because it has no power? Go on then, Missouri, after another set of inhabitants, as the Latter-day Saints did, have entered some $200,000 or $300,000 worth of land and made an extensive improvements thereon. Go on then, I say, banish the occupants or owners or kill them, as the mobbers did many of the Latter-day Saints, and take their lands and property as a spoil. And let the legislature, as in the case of the Mormons, appropriate $200,000 to pay the mob for doing the job. For the renowned senator for South Carolina, Mr. J.C. Calhoun, says the powers of the federal government are so specific and limited that it has no jurisdiction in the case. O ye people who groan under the oppression of tyrants, ye exiled Poles who have felt the iron hand of Russian grip, ye poor and unfortunate among all nations, come to the asylum of the oppressed. Buy ye lands of the general government, pay in your money to the treasury to strengthen the army and the navy. Worship God according to the dictates of your own conscience. Pay in your taxes to support the great heads of the glorious nation. But remember, a sovereign state is so much more powerful than the United States, the parent government, that it can exile you at pleasure, mob you with impunity, confiscate your lands and property, have the legislature sanction it, yea, even murder you as an edict of an emperor, and it does no wrong. For the noble senator of South Carolina says the power of the federal government is so limited and specific that it has no jurisdiction of the case. What think ye of Imperium in Imperio? Ye spirits of the blessed of all ages, hark. Ye shades of departed statesmen, listen. Abraham, Moses, Homer, Socrates, Solomon, and all that ever thought of right and wrong, look down from your exaltations if you have any. For it is said, in the midst of counselors there is safety. And when you have learned that 15,000 innocent citizens, after having purchased their lands from the United States and paid for them, were expelled from a sovereign state by order of the governor at the point of bayonet, their arms taken from them by the same authority, and the right of migration into said state denied under pain of imprisonment, whipping, robbing, mobbing, and even death, and no justice or recompense allowed. And from the legislature, with the governor at the head down to the justice at the peace, with a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a bowie knife in the other, hear them all declare that there is no justice for a Mormon in that state, and judge ye a righteous judgment, and tell me that when the virtues of the states was stolen, where the honor of the general government lies hid, and what clothes the senator with wisdom. O nullifying Carolina, O little tempestuous Rhode Island. Would it not be well for the great men of the nation to read the fable of the partial judge? And when part of the free citizens of the state had been expelled contrary to the Constitution, mobbed, robbed, plundered, and many murdered, instead of searching into the course taken by Joanna Southcott, Anne Lee, the French prophets, the Quakers of New England, and the rebellious niggers in the slave states to hear both sides and then judge, rather than have the mortification to say, oh, it is my bull that killed your ox? That alters the case. I must inquire into it, and if, and so on and so forth. If the general government has no power to reinstate expelled citizens to their right, there is a monstrous hypocrite fed and fostered from the hard earnings of the people, a real bull beggar upheld by sycophants, And although you may wink to the priests to stigmatize, wheedle the drunkards to swear, and raise the hue and cry of impostor, false prophet, goddamn old Joe Smith, yet remember, if the Latter-day Saints are not restored to all their rights and paid for all their losses according to the known rules of justice and judgment, reciprocation and common honesty among men, that God will come out of his hiding place and vex this nation with a sore vexation. Yea, the consuming wrath of an offended God shall smoke through the nation with as much distress and woe as independence has blazed through with pleasure and delight. Where is the strength of the government? Where is the patriotism of a Washington, a Warren, and Adams? And where is a spark from the watchfire of 76 by which one candle might be lit that would glimmer upon the confines of democracy? Well may it be said that one man is not a state, nor one state the nation. In the days of General Jackson, when France refused the first installment for spoliations, there was power, force, and honor enough to resent injustice and insult, and the money came. And shall Missouri, filled with Negro drivers and white men stealers, go unwhipped of justice for tenfold greater sins than France? No, verily no! While I have powers of body and mind, while water runs and grass grows, while virtue is lovely and vice hateful, and while a stone points out a sacred spot where a fragment of American liberty once was, I or my posterity will plead the cause of injured innocence until Missouri makes atonement for all her sins, or sinks disgraced, degraded, and damned to hell, where the worm dieth not and the fire is not quenched. Why, sir, the power not delegated to the United States and the states belongs to the people, and Congress sent to do the people's business have all power, and shall 15,000 citizens groan in exile? O vain men, will ye not, if ye do not restore them to their rights and $2 million worth of property? $2 million? That had grown a lot. Relinquish to them, the Latter-day Saints as a body, their portion of power that belongs to them according to the Constitution. Power has its convenience as well as inconvenience. The world was not made for Caesar alone, but Titus too. And let me say that all men who say that Congress has no power to restore and defend the rights of her citizens have not the love of truth abiding in them. Congress has power to protect the nation against foreign invasion and internal broil, and whenever that body passes an act to maintain right with any power or to restore right to any portion of her citizens, it is the supreme law of the land. And should a state refuse submission, that state is guilty of insurrection or rebellion, and the president has as much power to repel it as Washington had to march against the whiskey boys of Pittsburgh, or General Jackson had to send an armed force to suppress the rebellion of South Carolina. To close, I will admonish you, before you let your candor compel you again to write upon a subject great as the salvation of man and consequential as the life of the Savior, broad as the principles of eternal truth, and valuable as the jewels of eternity, to read in the 8th section and 1st article of the Constitution of the United States, the 1st, 14th, and 17th specific and not very limited powers of the federal government. What can be done to protect the lives, property, and rights of a virtuous people when the administrators of the law and lawmakers are unbought by bribes, uncorrupted by patronage, untempted by gold, unawed by fear, and uncontaminated by tangling alliances? Even like Caesar's wife, not only unspotted, but unsuspected. And God, who cooled the heat of Nebuchadnezzar's furnace, or shut the mouths of lions for the honor of a Daniel, will raise your mind above the narrow notion that the general government has no power to the sublime idea that Congress, with the president as executor, is as almighty in its sphere as Jehovah is in his. With great respect, I have the honor to be your obedient servant. Signed, Joseph Smith. End quote. It's important to understand the mentality of the Mormons and the religious leaders at this time. The Mormons had suffered a lot in nearly 14 years that they'd been a religion by 1844, from mobs chasing them from town to town, to destroying their property, to multiple arrests of the prophet and high-ranking church leaders, to lawsuits, to the more overt perceived persecution in Missouri. In Missouri, the Mormons had come against their most powerful enemies to the point: supremacist Missourians. The Missourians didn't like the Mormons didn't like the Missourians killed a bunch of Mormons, the Mormons killed a few Missourians, and then the Missourians won, because the Mormons were violently removed from the state. That horrible time for the Mormons, that very real trauma that they suffered in Missouri, that was a bottomless well to draw from in order to reinforce the Mormon persecution complex. And that's the underlying trend in all of these incidents. The Mormon persecution complex. You simply can't be a powerful religious leader if you don't have an enemy to galvanize your people against. Now, for most American religions at this time, these threats were ethereal. Satan, the powers of evil ruling the world. But a person can only fight an unseen force by using their own unforeseen forces of prayer and piety for so long. This narrative works for most religions, but other religions, more charismatic religions like Mormonism, need a more temporal and tangible enemy. Small religions, in particular, thrive on having a physical common enemy. Instead of Satan being the enemy, it's Satanists or atheists. Instead of the family being torn apart, it's the gays that are tearing families apart. Instead of the forces of darkness ruling the unenlightened world, it's communist Russia that's going to take over. Unless communist Russia helped your favorite candidate get elected, then we're totally cool with Russia once again, right? Whatever. Having a common enemy is one of the constituent pieces to a successful religion. The piece is integral. It's necessary. That otherizing is required for a religious group to work and function. You have to have an evil them to have a chosen us. Far from mitigating these human tendencies, Joseph Smith capitalized on them. He stoked the flames of religious supremacy in his group and inferiority of the rest of the world. He exacerbated this problem because he benefited from it, and it made his followers more devout. But where does this end? You begin to vilify anybody who doesn't like your religion. You eventually arrive at a point where you have to vilify anybody who isn't even a member of your religion. Those who aren't possible investigators, anyway. Eventually, any person who speaks ill of your religion, even from the inside, is a traitor, a heretic, an apostate. Then anybody that they talk to are colluding with the apostates and can never be forgiven for their treason. Then the whole world is evil and only your religion is acceptable and all other religions are evil abominations. All news reports that are favorable are to be enjoyed. Anything in opposition is slanderous fake news. Eventually, the government is trying at every turn to destroy your religion, and if not for the free exercise of religion, the government would march into your religious town and massacre every single member of the us group. It's how cults work, and it's not a slippery slope fallacy if the slippery slope is real, and that is exactly what happened with the Mormons and the rest of the world in the 19th century. This results in a big question. Was the persecution narrative championed and leveraged by Joseph Smith calculated or sincerely believed? Humans are programmed for efficiency, and they rarely consider their own beliefs through a skeptical lens because that requires mental resources. I believe that Joe floated out the persecution narrative back in New York years, back in 1830, because he genuinely believed that he was being persecuted, even if the primary persecutors were his friends and fellow magicians just 3 years before the religion began. The persecution narrative worked then, and I think he simply ran with it. It was a pattern that worked, and then he never questioned whether or not it was a good idea. As a religious leader, he spewed from the pulpit religious supremacist ideas, and the followers grew. The tithing income increased, and the people began to swear their lives and fealty to the cause. It's organic. This happens everywhere, and it needn't an explanation in malice. It's incredibly effective. Tap into the Mormons' collective shared trauma anytime the will of the prophet is opposed by anything or anybody, and including if that thing opposing the prophet is the due process of law, and instantly the majority of Joe's sycophants are goose-stepping in line behind their supreme leader. What couldn't be accomplished with 15,000 who are willing to die for their beliefs? What can't be accomplished with 7 million who are willing to follow the prophet through thick and thin without asking questions? The same persecution narrative that was organically crafted by the founder, likely subconsciously, it survives and it thrives today. The escalation that we see in the 1840s, it never ratcheted down. The heat on this boiling pot of religious persecution was never reduced. Rational actors and critical voices have no place inside this persecution narrative. Any effort to diffuse the situation results in the person who feels persecuted thinking they're being persecuted even more. Persecution is used by leaders to control members, and those same leaders have been hearing the narrative of persecution their whole lives, so of course they believe it and perpetuate it. The more this happens, the more civil discourse dies. We have ex-Mormons screaming at apologists about historicity and anachronisms. We have apologists screaming at ex-Mormons supposedly committing crimes when they write cesletter.org on the cover page of the Book of Mormon when they stay at a Marriott. It only escalates. Escalation in this irrationality fosters anger, hatred, and frustration in the minds of all those who participate in it. And this escalation has roots in the very foundation of the church. The worst part of this escalation is its causal relationship to otherizing. Otherizing. We're locked in a race of mutually assured dehumanization. It's a mad doctrine, and that's a trend which pervades every single aspect of our culture and day-to-day life. Not just Mormonism. So when an apologist writes a blog post that's flippant in its generalizations, or an ex-Mormon says that Mormonism is a cult, don't buy into the mad doctrine of Mormonism, mutually assured dehumanization. A PSA from yours truly here. We all commit logical fallacies. We all see our interlocutors as idiots. We're all quick to champion somebody on our side and dehumanize somebody on the other. We all wait with bated breath for the next smackdown or gotcha. But none of these things are actually good, because guess what? We're all humans. We're all working with the same equipment here. We all have stuff going on in our lives that we take joy from or is stressing us out. We all have things and people that we love and hate. All of our brains operate in fundamentally the same way, just with different information. The more we play into this mutually assured dehumanization, the more we fall into the same patterns that exiled Brigham Young's Mormons to Mexico, where they committed genocide with impunity. We can never learn from history if we keep repeating the patterns that caused it to be the way it is. I applaud people who post thoughtful articles or blogs that are meaningful and are thought-provoking, believer or not, it doesn't matter. But for every one of those articles, there are 15 slams from one side against the other. This escalation only drives us all closer to madness. That's going to do it for our podcast episode today. Thank you all so much for listening in. A couple of announcements coming up. We have John Whitmer Historical Association going on in Fairport, New York, September 26th through the 29th. The week after that, we have the March for the Children happening in Salt Lake City. You're going to find information for both of these events in the show notes. But October 5th is going to be the next installment of the March for the Children, dovetailing off of all of the support that is coming to stop ecclesiastical abuse going on in the church and in churches around the world. It's an important cause. I'd really love to see you in Salt Lake City if you're going to be there. And if not, share it. Let people know about it. It'd be really, really cool to get as much support for this cause as possible to stop abuse from happening in the church. Once again, October 5th, you're going to find information in the show notes for protecteverychild.org. Also, final announcement, letter for my wife. This is the cousin to the CES letter. Letter for My Wife just published their audio version of the letter on letterformywife.com. You can check the show notes to find a link to that. It is a really good and interesting listen/read, if that's something that interests you, just a high-level overview of some major historical issues that are similarly covered in the CES letter. And I'm working currently with the author to hopefully come on the show at some point in the near future to discuss a letter from my wife, the genesis of it, and what it has become, and, what the future is for it as well. Final announcement, we have a couple of new patrons to thank over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. We have a new pledge by John, a new pledge by Rebecca, and by Roy, and we also have a pledge edit by Doug. So to all of our patrons, and especially to our newest patrons over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism, from the bottom of my heart, I extend my deepest gratitude for your generosity. You're giving money to me to fund the research that goes into this show and all the ancillary projects that I seem to not be able to say no to. So thank you all. And my way of saying thank you is by providing you a bunch of extra content. You get the variety show after the main segment of this show, where, that's the NSFW section. That's where I kind of take the gloves off and just, kind of sit down and chat with y'all and, kind of strip away the character, go a more naked version of the host of Naked Mormonism. So if you're interested in that, as well as an extra episode every week, head on over to patreon.com/nakedmormonism to pledge to support this research and journalistic endeavor. If you're not able to support the show through money, you can still support it through likes and shares. You give us a 5-star review on iTunes or Stitcher or your podcasting app of choice. That really helps with visibility and to get the message out there. Also want to give a heads up and a shout out to the last podcast on the left. They are doing what looks to me, they think they're going to do a 5-part series on Mormonism. They're 3 parts in right now. I think they're probably going to go more than 5 parts, but they're doing a really good job of just kind of a high-level overview of early Mormon history, and it's really funny to hear non-Mormons talk about Mormon history through the lens of No Man Knows My History and Rough Stone Rolling. It's a lot of fun. Give that a listen. They have, like I said, 3 episodes up at the time that this podcast is airing. Episode 4 should be coming early next week. That's going to be in the middle week of September. And I'm looking forward to the rest of the last podcast on the left episodes about Mormonism. With all of that, we are all done for the evening. I want to thank you all so much for tuning in and lending me your ear. And for all the people who do support the show and rate it and tune in. You're still here. You're listening. You hit the download button. And that's really what matters. So thank you so much for lending me your ear. I'll talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.